Welcome to week 3 of Automating GIS processes. This week we will be talking about geocoding and doing some spatial analysis with point and polygon queries and making some spatial joins and doing some nearest neighbor analysis in the end. So this week we have quite a few notebooks to go through, even though the last two notebooks on spatial index and nearest neighbor analysis with large data sets are optional. So they're more if you want to learn more and if you want to use those for inspiration or when working with your final project or any other projects that you want to. So if we have extra time, I might go briefly through them in the end, but let's start with the first topic of today, which is geocoding. So on the course web pages, there's a short article on geocoding. So the process of taking information and transforming place names or addresses into geographic coordinates. So there are several ways to do that. In Python, we're going to be using a library called GeoPy that works in and of itself, but also in conjunction with Geopandas. And in the background of GeoPy, there are different geocoders and services that look up these addresses for us. So the same thing that when you in Google Maps or OpenStreetMap, you type in an address, there is a geocoder that finds that point on the map and returns that to you. And we're going to be doing the same thing, just in getting the coordinates and positions directly into our Python code. So yes, on this article, you can read more about different types of geocoders that you can use in different services. We will be using one that is called Nominatim, which works with OpenStreetMap data, so that it is free to use and uses the open access OpenStreetMap data, which is nice. So some of these different services have also priced services. So if you are using or building a larger project that you want to collect many different or many places at once and very often, then there are different price ranges that you can use. But for the small data sets that we will be using today and in the exercise, Nominatim works great, even though there are some rate limits that if you want to look up hundreds of thousands of addresses, then you might not be able to, but we will be working with a smaller data set, so that should work pretty good. So yes, geocoding, you can read more about the different services and the documentation for GeoPy and Nominatim here, but we will start with the coding lesson for today. If there are no questions, feel free to post them in the chat or let me know if I'm going too slow or need to repeat something. So yes, I'll be heading over to my Jupyter Lab instance here. And under the AutoGIS notebooks and lesson 3, we'll open the first notebook, Geocoding in Geopandas. So, as I mentioned, it is possible to use Geopandas together with GeoPy to directly geocode, for example, a list of addresses in a geo data frame. So that is very handy, and we will be doing that today, and you will also be doing some of that in the exercises. So for this lesson, we have in our data folder, we can take a look at a text file called addresses that contains a bunch of addresses in Helsinki. We have about 34 lines of addresses that are, as we can see here, we have an ID column and then an address. And we can also see that it is semicolon separated. So the addresses here have commas in them. So if we were to, if we were to load this file normally, it would split up the address in many different columns. So just keep in mind that we here are using semicolons, and that this is a good example of sometimes when you don't want to have a comma separated file, but something different, because the string that we are storing here contains commas. Okay, so back to the notebook. We will load this list of addresses and then try to geocode them in Geopandas. So what we first need to do is we will import pandas as PD, as we will be using pandas to read the text file. And then we will also later on be using Geopandas. So let's import that as well as GPD. And then we will also be using Shapely to get the point of these coordinates. So we will, from Shapely.geometry, we will import points. That's the modules that we need at this point. So the file path is in our data folder. The address is the text. So let's start to read in the data. Let's call it in a variable data. We will do pd.read CSV. It will be the file path. And as you remember, it was a semicolon separator. So we need to pass the separator parameter, which is sep. And then within quotation marks, a semicolon. So if we run this cell, it loads, seems that it loaded the data. So we can check whether it was imported or loaded correctly. So first we can check out the length of our data. It has 34 rows, so that looks good. And we can also check out the head of our data to see the first 5 instances or rows of the data. So yes, you can see here we have an ID column with the IDs and then an address column called ADBR with all the different addresses. So far, so good. Then on to the next step, which is to geocode these addresses. So for that, we will need the geocoding tool of Geopandas. So that is an extra tool that is not necessarily imported right away. So we need to make sure that it is loaded and ready to use. So to do that, we will, from geopandas.tools, we will import geocode, which it is called. We'll run that just to make sure that it runs correctly. So it does. And then we will be using the geocode function of Geopandas. So we can take a look at the documentation for that by clicking on the link. And then that link does not work today. Okay, so sorry about that. Then we will have to go by memory. So the geocode function from Geopandas works by it takes a column from our data frame or a series of addresses. So let's start by typing geocode, and then within the function, we pass it the list of addresses that we want to geocode, and that was in our data frame in the column ADDR, which we saw above here. So this column, and then back inside here, we also need to specify the provider that we will be using. So in the provider parameter, we will pass nominatim, which is what we are using for the OpenStreetMap data. Tim. And then it's also good practice to provide a user agent in the geocoder, and that is to tell nominatim who are using it, so that it can recognize that if you are sending many requests, then it knows it's from the same user. So in this instance, I will pass it. You can pass it something AutoGIS, and then underscore my initials, for example. That should be okay. And then lastly, we need to call a timeout parameter, which defines how long to wait for a response from the service if it takes if it wants to or needs to retry to fetch the data. So timeout, and I'll set that to 5 here. And let's go ahead and store this geocoded data in a new variable called geo. So if I run this now, let's see, I typed provider. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and run that. This might take a little bit of time to first pass the data over to nominatim and then get the response back to our computer. And also, since we are many people doing the same query at once from the same CSC environment, then some might get a error message saying that either a timeout error or something like that, that we have used too many requests at nominatim, which it seems that I got a timeout error. Let's see. Yeah. So this might happen to some of you, and that's okay. I'll just increase the timeout here and run again to see if that solves it. And if you're not able to do that, don't worry about it for now, because we also have prepared the addresses in another file for the next notebooks that we will be using. But if you have gotten the data in, maybe you can give a green check mark in the Zoom reactions, and we can see how many of you got the geocoder to work for now, while we wait for it to run on my computer at least. When you will be doing the exercises, you will most likely not do this at the exact same time, everyone. So that should not be a problem then. And then I see there's an error. Someone gets an error that they can't import geocode from Geopandas tools because of a typo, so that's all right. So yes, non-successful status code is also try to, for those who get that kind of error, try to set the timeout to increase it a bit and maybe run again. And we will see if we are able to get the data in. We can I'll type geo.head just to be prepared for when my is finished run. Okay, I got the same non-successful status code. All right, I will try once more. This is a classic example of the demo effect that when trying it out 1 hour ago, it worked perfectly fine. And now it just throws errors. Let's see if is there no one? I saw one green check mark before, but now it has gone. Is there anyone who has gotten the geocoder to work today? Yes. So at least the instructions are correct. That's good. All right. Let me just see if I quota exceeded. Yeah. So seems that there are a few people who are getting it to work correctly, and then others have the same issue as me. So I'll just wait for mine to try to run through. See, and it seems that there others are getting errors that it might be a larger issue at nominatim. And others got it working with timeout equals 10. All right, okay. So if you, it seems that mine ran through okay now. So if it didn't work for you on your own computer, then that's okay. We will be, I will run through the rest of this notebook. So just following along here, we will export, or we will in the other notebooks read in a local file with the same information. But then you could maybe try that when at a different time or when not everyone is doing it. And then in the exercises, it should be, hopefully it should be working for everyone. But it also looks like at least half have given a green check mark. So I'll continue here in my notebook with the data and then just follow along here for the few cells that are left in this notebook. So yes, we ran the geocoder, and saved that in a new variable called geo. So let's take a look at what we have here. So now we have a geodata frame with a geometry column with shapely point objects, and then an address column with the different addresses. So what you saw, or what you might see from here, is that we have a completely new geodata frame with a new index, and we don't have the same other variables or other values that were in the original data frame. So above here we had the ID, for example, which might be useful later on. So that is what we're going to do now, to try to join that data back into together with the geocoded data and perform a table join. So we have done some joining of data before in GeoPython, in the GeoPython course, but we haven't covered it in detail before. So here we will be doing some, or there are several ways of joining data from one table into another. And you can, in this, if you click this link in the box here, there are, in the documentation for pandas, there it describes the different ways of merging or joining or concatenating and comparing different data frames together. I won't go into detail into each of these. We will be doing a joining of the two different tables at this point. So what we want to do is get the data from our original data frame, the list of addresses and their IDs, and get them, join that into our geocoded points geodata frame. So to do that, I'll create a join variable, and in that start with our geodata frame, and we want to join in data from our data frame. So by just running this, it runs perfectly. We can even check the head of the file to see the contents, and we can see here we have our points, our addresses from the geocoder, the ID from our data, and the addresses from the text file that we had in the beginning. So that is just a simple way to join the two data frames together. So it does it based on the index that we have. So at least if you have simple data sets, this will work just fine. We can even check the type of our join table, and we can see that it's a geodata frame. So that is because we started with the geodata frame here, and then joined the data from data into that geodata frame. Had we done it the other way around, started with the data and then joined the geodata frame into that, we would have ended up with a data frame, not a geodata frame. So just keep that in mind, that the order in which you're doing it matters at some time. Yeah, so they matter in the output you get. And then there's a question about the address columns, that if you look at them, they are not exactly the same. And that is a very, very good point. Remember to be kind of cautious of that. So the addresses that we had in our first list, when we passed them on into our geocoder, nominatim, that finds the address that is in their database closest to that point, and then returns that new address. So in that sense, it might not be the exact same address, at least not in the string of it, but it's the closest one in their database that they find. So that is a good thing to be cautious about when you are doing this kind of operations. Okay, so now that we have joined our data frames, we can save the new data frames into a shapefile. So we can do that by typing join, and then to file, and we have our output file path here. And if we run that, it saves the geocoded addresses into a shapefile.